So, hi, can everyone hear me? Okay, wonderful, wonderful. First hurdle cleared nice and easily. Fantastic that you've all come here today. Welcome, welcome. I've got an incredibly wonderful panel up here, and I can see so many people in this room who are not just very intelligent, but also working in this field very actively. So I'm sure that I've probably got the toughest job of actually controlling and getting as much out of this room as we possibly can and keeping us to time. But thank you very much for coming on here this evening to this panel that's being run, which is about how can schools tackle misogyny, embedding equality in education. And welcome here to the ODI Global venue, and thank you very much for hosting us. And personally, my own introduction, I'm Daniel Guinness from Beyond Equality, and we're really glad to be co-hosting, and I'm glad to be moderating this event. So a bit of housekeeping before we get going. This is an in-person only event. However, we will be recording it for people who weren't able to attend. We're going to try to give plenty of opportunities for you actually be sharing your ideas and your questions. Please, as we go through this, jot them down on a piece of paper in the back of your head, and we'll collect them at the end. Please also consider staying around for the reception and a bit of networking afterwards. There'll be some time for that. The session overall is structured in two parts. Firstly, we're going to hear from the panel, and we're going to go deep into three areas: the general context, what's actually working in terms of interventions, and then what policy work do we need to actually support those good practices, those best practices. And then there's going to be opportunity for questions and discussion. Okay. That out of the way, can actually get started. So I'm sure that many of you are here because you either know someone on the panel, maybe the work of Beyond Equality, or aligns world-leading research on changing gender norms. And with the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women yesterday, we thought this was a really critical conversation to have. Now, this year, for the people who've been working in this space, there was a lot of noise that came after the Adolescence series came out. And that focused on the absolute most severe outcomes of misogynistic content and the way that it's influencing our young people, and also the lack of support structures that are around them to actually prevent them being radicalized by that content. And this sparked a worldwide conversation, right? And I'm sure ones that probably every single person in this room has in some way been a part of. And yet, for decades, experts, people who are practitioners, civil organizations like our own, have been very actively thinking about how do you actually solve these problems? And I know there's many people in the room who've also actively been doing that work. So what is the impact if we can actually take a gender lens to the way we try to provide education for everyone, and we can actually do some preventative work in the longer term? So while public concern reached new heights this year, we wanted to make sure that those conversations actually led to some momentum and some change, some investment in things that will actually mean in 10 years' time, the story is different from what it is today. And that's why today we're going to have conversations about practical solutions and how we can translate things into policy. This is increasingly urgent, especially as in this new information environment, sexism and violence against women isn't getting better, it's in fact getting worse. That plays out in figures. So apologies for reading this here. According to the National Audit Office report, the prevalence of sexual assaults increased from 3.4% of the population each year to 4.3% of the population in 2023 to 24. Police reports of rape and sexual assault increased from 34,000 to 123,000 over the same period. So that's almost a 4-time increase. Nearly half of sexually active people in the UK, sexually active young people in the UK, have experienced strangulation, according to new research. More than 2 in 5 sexually active under 18s in the UK have either been strangled or strangled someone during sex. And the most common reason was for their partner's enjoyment, not their own. Since 2024, strangulation was the cause of death in 27% of cases where women were killed since 2014. And in the UK alone, police the Police Chiefs Council reported in 2024 that 2 million women a year are victims of men's violence. So we see a problem that's both of scale and is incredibly, horribly impactful. It's very clear in that context that there's work to be done in how we actually work with young men and boys. How can we nurture masculinities that are healthier for them and certainly healthier for the people around them? And the evidence base that we've got makes a very strong case for embedding equity in our education systems as a whole. The people on this panel and others in the room have seen firsthand the potential to change these social norms, to make an impact in this area. And we're able to actually challenge some of those stereotypes, defy those discriminatory logics, and plant the seeds of long-term change. We know that we need to take a gender lens to content and all teaching content, and we need spaces that adequately support each person's development. The Gender Equality and Social Inclusion program here at ODI, in their Whose Hands on Our Education report, has also shed light on the growing anti-gender backlash, which is now funding concerted efforts to derail progress on gender equality in schools. So we're up against some funded forces from the opposite direction. And the Equimundo State of UK Men report, launched in partnership with Beyond Equality, added to the growing evidence of the way in which that has actually been impactful in leading to a rising amount of anti-gender attitudes amongst a large minority of the population, particularly men. So, without doubt, that advancing efforts to combat misogyny is going to require a determined effort and one that cuts across multiple different levels of our society, which is why we put together a panel who can speak to multiple different levels of our society. And without any further ado, I'll turn to them and introduce them now. So, I really am genuinely delighted to be joined by this panel. We have Lib Peck, who's the director of the Violence Reduction Unit at the London Mayor's City Hall for the past 6.5 years, since the start. So you've seen things run, you see things grow, you see things succeed and some challenges, I'm sure. Yeah. Dr. Patrick Roach, CBE, former General Secretary of the Teachers Union, NAS UWT, and you've got a wealth of experience teaching further education and also in that particular role to draw upon. Nick Dunn, who's the director of the Global Community for Men's Health program at Movember, and you've also previously worked for 13 years at Brook and in therapy settings with young men. And last but not least, ODI's Global's own Rachel Marcus, Senior Research Fellow in the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion team. So thank you very much for joining us. I know everyone in the audience is very excited to hear what you've got to say. So our first area that we want to start talking about is what's actually generally happening. What's the lay of the land here? Education is one of the most promising avenues to embed equality for a lifetime. And we're reaching people when they're young, we're reaching them as they're developing. And schools come to us at Beyond Equality for a whole range of reasons. Now, that might be that they've got a bullying problem, that they're seeing that their boys are dropping out of class or disengaging. They might have seen a rise in harassment, or maybe misogynistic comments made towards women teachers. However, what we do is actually see that a lot of those have the same root cause, right? A collection of gender ideas and other ideologies that the young boys have been socialized into. It's not the only cause, but it's one of the key root causes here. Now, the particular norms might vary across community, culture, and generation, and each individual is influenced by a whole range of different things related to their identities and where they sit in society. So obviously, to address these roots, we really need to take a whole of society approach, partnering with communities, NGOs, governments, and schools to invest in a whole of person solution. And that's all bearing in mind that we really need to bring a bit more control over the digital platforms at the moment, which are so influential. But having said all of that, today's focus is the education system. And we know that significant progress can be achieved there. So Lib, given we're here in London, given you've been doing this for 6.5 years and you've had lots of programs that have rolled out and partnerships, it'd be wonderful to hear about this work that you've done with Mayor Sadiq Khan on reducing men's violence against women. Can you outline City Hall's understanding of the links between gendered violence and norms? And what are you seeing in terms of the negative trends over the past few years?
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, that's a very big question, actually. And I suppose I think you've started by giving quite a lot of context setting already. But I'll just highlight a little bit of that because I know we're going to delve into a little bit more about the impact of different programs. But I mean, the first, I suppose, is to say that very often violence against women and girls is referred to as a kind of epidemic. And I, by and large, try and sort of move away from those sort of sensationalist words because I'm never quite sure it does anything other than strike fear into people. But I think in this particular context, actually, it is quite accurate. And I think the figure that you drew on in terms of the reported incidents and therefore the increase in terms of violence affecting women over the last 5 years and the 37% kind of increase there that you talked about, the fact that we know, a woman is killed every 3 days, I think still, and the implications of that. And also the fact that, 1 in 12 women are going to experience violence sometime in the next year really does give us, unfortunately, a very powerful context as to why it's so important that we are, and so many people here, doing already fantastic work to eliminate that. We have and have had a very specific focus in the Violence Reduction Unit over the last 6.5 years, working very closely with young people. And again, that 18 to 25 is where we're seeing an increase in the violence in relationships. And it's where we hear from young women and young boys, young men who are perhaps lost, although if they're working very closely with us and engaging in our programs, we're probably beginning to see some path towards progress. But nonetheless, from young women's perspectives, they feel very, very assaulted and very frightened. And that feels very influenced by online. And I think the absence of male role models in that space that are positive, as opposed to the negative male influences, such as your Andrew Tates and other prolific social influencers who are peddling this misogynistic rhetoric and narrative, is really having an impact. And I'm sure we'll get on later to saying what that means in terms of young people in school environments. So a profound issue that certainly the Mayor and certainly through the Violence Reduction Unit and all sorts of initiatives across City Hall in tandem with many of the people I can see in the audience working hard to try and make an impact.
Well, thanks, Lib. Shifting focus slightly, zooming really in, Nick, you've been in schools, you're working there with boys. What are you actually seeing in terms of how those norms play out in their lives, their attitudes, what they talk about, how they express themselves?
Yeah, thanks. I think I've had quite a unique sort of experience working for Brooke for 13 years, previous to that as a youth worker. And as a therapist, I kind of had it from all sort of angles, if you like, around how to support boys and young men. And I was one of, out of 60 education staff, the only male. So I tended to do the boys and young men work by sort of default, if you like. So I've seen the same kind of misogynistic attitudes exist 20 years ago to now, but what I've seen is it grow and sort of be turbocharged by what we're seeing from the pull of these online influencers. So boys and young men are telling me that they still have those traditional sort of stereotypes around masculinity: be strong, don't show emotions, be manly. But then they've got these added extra pressures now of being rich and ripped is a common term that boys and young men use to me, or to be sexually experienced before they've had sex and to be ready for sex. And sex has always been a challenge for boys and young men to navigate. There's always been a fear around that, even back to when I was a young person. But it's been really sort of heightened now in terms of they need to have that ready experience before they've gone anywhere near it. And also the control elements, being always in control and being in control of them and their emotions and their feelings. And I think that's something that I've seen grow. And if we look at the symptoms around that and why boys and young men are being pulled into these online spaces, it's because they're offering them something that they're not getting in real life, and that is connection or a feeling of connection in these spaces that have been removed in other areas of their lives. Place-based services have gone, as we know. So much pressure is put on teachers in this small amount of a window they've got for PSHE that actually there isn't enough time to unpack it. And I could go into many more symptoms. I know we haven't got time, but socioeconomic ones are obviously a key one. But also that connection is really an apparent one that we're trying to challenge. I tried to challenge it in my work at Brook and was making progress. And it's why I've moved over to November now to try and even sort of move that even further into the space to have that conversation.
Thank you very much for that. And I think you said, I mean, many important things there. But I do think it's important to emphasize that point. You said, okay, socioeconomic factors do play in here, and we should remember that even as we have this conversation about men and boys, we should also be attentive to the ways in which their experience is multiple. We're dealing with different people, dealing with different things, and there's a lot of resonance with what we see from Beyond Equality in terms of that linkage of the boys' needs, and then they're going looking for very needed answers in such terrible places.
Add to that as well. They're going to look for it sometimes, but also we found through research in November that they're going to look for, say, a gym technique, and within 2 swipes of a video, they're getting misogynistic content that they're not looking for. It's being fed to them. So there's one thing about them looking for it, and there's the other thing about them actually being pushed it as well. So there's 2 sort of strands there that need to be looked at.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Patrick. Teachers, Nick's pointed out they've got a lot thrown on top of them. They're responsible for not only a curriculum these days, but also filling in a lot of the gaps that have been left there for actually helping support and raise young people. What are you hearing, or what did you hear when you were in your previous role from your members who are teachers about the challenges they face in actually addressing these sorts of issues in the classroom?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the points that both Nick and Liv have referred to already are the ones that resonate with teachers. I mean, 5 years ago, our annual conference debated an important motion on tackling misogyny and incel cultures within schools, and I was accused of scaremongering and sensationalism. And I think your point, Lib, about should we refer to this as an epidemic, and does that lead to if you will, a failure to engage in the detail of the issues that we should be debating? I don't think it does. And actually, we roll forward 5 years, and everyone's talking about the issues that we were talking about then. So to some degree, I think I feel a bit vindicated in talking about that. But not only 5 years ago, 20 years ago, my union was talking about the issues of masculinities within schools, within education, and how we can develop a grounding for young people, which embodies a more progressive form of masculinity. And how do we, or who do we see as role models for boys? And we may touch on this a bit later on in terms of the discussion we're going to have this evening. But I do think these things have been playing out for some while, and teachers have been talking about these issues for some while. But what is different today is that the concern around misogyny, misogynoir, all forms of discrimination, of hatred towards women in particular, how that has been amplified, how that has almost been put on steroids, really. And that's more than just simply 1 or 2 bad actors. Yes, my former members, I have to refer to them as that. 2/3 of them did say, they're concerned about the influence of the Andrew Tates of this world. But it ain't just 1 or 2 bad actors. It isn't just about, boys making poor choices about where to find information. There's a real safeguarding issue at the heart of all of this, which is about how boys, how young men are being guided towards, directed towards particular forms of content by unregulated social media platforms, by platforms which are actually profiting from the selling of this kind of content. I mean, that's the reality that we're dealing with. That's the reality that teachers are dealing with in terms of how they can support boys and young men in their schools and colleges, but it's how we are trying to address these issues at societal level in terms of where do we get our information. I was reflecting on the question of, you can see the grey hairs. I can think back to where I got information when I was a young man, and the sources were relatively limited. You know, maybe my parents, maybe my friends, maybe what was in the newspaper or on TV or on radio. Today, there's a multiplicity of sources, and schools are trying to, in a sense, combat that. They are trying to deal with those issues, though that assault on boys in a way which is profound and which means that schools need to be connected to other agencies in order to make difference to young people's lives.
Thank you very much for that impassioned point there. I can see it resonates with a lot of us here. Working as an organization, working and training up a lot of teachers, something that they say to us is, what's happened over the past 5 years, as I think both Nick and Patrick have pointed to, is there's been almost like a crystallization of some of the misogynistic ideologies and a giving of language to it that then actually young men can repeat straight to the teacher in the classroom, which is just speaking to that different source of information that would have been there when I was back at school.
I think I've got a head start on you, but you're absolutely right about that. And teaching is a feminized profession. 75% of teachers working in our schools are women, and what women teachers were telling me was that their ability to teach is under threat, is under assault because of this rise of misogyny.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that in. I think it's a huge impact that we should talk about. Rachel, you've been a huge part of the Align platform, and with that, the research that you've been doing internationally on actually how do we nurture gender equitable masculinities. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room would like to hear, actually, why is it important to focus on schools and the educational sector as a critical avenue for these longer term and sustainable norms changes?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I mean, first of all, schools, as I think we all recognise, are a unique space to reach a large cohort of children and young people at a time when they're particularly open to learning, forming their identities, figuring out who they are, who they want to be. And there are also spaces where children encounter substantial influence, both from key adults like teachers and other people in schools, and then also from their peer groups. And those have a profound influence both on reinforcing certain norms, but also being a space where new norms can arise and young people themselves can create those new norms. Because, if there's anything I remember about being young or being a parent to teenagers, and I've seen, is, you definitely want to show how you're different to previous generations. And some of that is norms around gender, whether it's going more equitable and really fighting for equality and seeing yourself different to the older generation that way, or going down a more misogynistic route. And we've been doing research looking at international practices to promote gender equality and nurturing gender equitable masculinities through education over the last few years. And one thing the studies we've looked at has consistently shown is that encountering ideas of equality and respect in school can have a lasting effect. So one initiative that we looked at in India, for example, that worked with 12 to 14-year-olds over a 2-year period, embedding content on gender equality into their curriculum every week and also through extracurricular clubs, is that not only did it change attitudes towards gender equality on a range of indicators, most impressively, that actually lasted. So 2 years after those children were no longer in those lessons, some of that positive impact remained. They still had more equitable attitudes. And closer to home here in London, a programme that's been working with year 2 to year 6 children in primary school, again, has shown really impressive results on getting children to think differently about stereotypes, no longer thinking about things as boys and girls games or clothes or colors, and also changing their perceptions of what they can and what they might want to be as adults. So all of this matters because where gender equality is a norm, then misogynistic attitudes that support violence against women and girls are very much less likely to flourish. And so even if you're not directly talking about violence, you're building a bedrock for non-violent attitudes and for gender equality overall. And this is much more likely to happen, we found, through an intentional approach, which is internationally referred to as a gender transformative approach. I don't think that's jargon that doesn't resonate so much here. And what that means really is simply embedding gender equality content in the curriculum, reinforcing values of equality outside the classroom and through extracurricular activities. And I think, in the next round of questions, then I think we'll be talking a bit more about how you can actually do that.
Yeah, precisely. We'll turn to that very, very soon. I just wanted to get Lib's take on this. We're hearing how important schools are. Has that driven the mayors and the violence reduction units thinking here?
Definitely. Started from probably a non-gendered lens, which is an odd thing to say in this environment, but a true one, which was really thinking about, we know one of the key protective factors for young people, so they don't get exploited, don't get caught up in violence, is to be in school. And if you then start tracking back and thinking, why are young people being excluded from school? Why are there higher suspensions? What is happening around managed moves? And post-COVID, there is quite a high rate of absenteeism. How can we kind of reverse that? And we did a big piece of research with the University of Bath, went out to 4,000 young Londoners, and we found that the kind of essence of why young people were finding and struggling with school was a sense of not being listened to, not having a voice, not feeling any sense of belonging, and not it being a place for them. Now, I don't want to exaggerate that to the point of saying that's everybody's experience, but certainly those are the things that came across most powerfully. So I suppose from that perspective, we then had a very clear set of issues that were being explained back to us through young people. At the same time, we know that when we really delved into that, there then was actually a gendered lens to that research, and that young women felt, or girls felt, less of a sense of belonging. And in fact, the idea that we were talking about people necessarily being safer in school was also quite challenging because, 10% of girls were thinking that they, didn't want to go into school because they were fearful of some kind of sexual harassment. And 1 in 4 girls in mixed schools had also reported that, they had experienced unwanted touching in the school. So that then gave us, I think, from both of those perspectives, a really importance about what is going on in schools. How do we think about changing the system at that macro level, but how also do we provide that support to young people, both girls and young women, but also boys as well. So yeah, very much so. That has been a big focus of us at the Violence Reduction Unit.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really fascinated to see how actually 2 logics that came from quite different directions have linked up to the same conclusion, that we need to be looking in a very gender transformative way about how we're reaching young men, young women, non-binary people in ways that are applicable and give them all that sense of belonging, all that opportunity to actually develop, which I think allows us to bridge quite nicely to what actually works. This is a pretty key conversation. Get your pens out. So we can think about content, we can think about delivery practices, we can think, as has already been discussed, how you actually turn something from a one-off lesson or like a multi-program thing into something that the school really sees as like a whole of school approach. So Nick, wanted to go to you first because you do have that wealth of experience across multiple different organizations actually, but particularly here, your experience in Brook as a sexual health educator, and now working for Movember, also with health, with some accompanying music. Like, can you give us some of your, stepping backwards a little bit, what are some of the lessons you've learned about what works?
Sure, against that backdrop. There you go. Was it the tractors, is it? Yeah, yeah.
Farmers and
Perfect
tractors.
time.
Okay, we've
Thank
got
you
to
for
the
that.
bottom of it here. Thanks, Liv. Two of them by the looks of it, but anyway.
So I'm trying to remember what you
Yeah. What works?
works?
What
All right.
works?
So I think when boys or young people in general can't share what they are viewing and consuming online safely, it goes unchallenged.
Mhm.
And I think we talk a lot, and you probably had this within IBC training or training around it. We did this a lot in Brook, saying create a safe space for young people. Right? So at the start of the lesson, if you're normally teaching English or maths and you're in that classroom where they're normally teaching that subject, then shift into talking about sex and pleasure and STIs and consent. It's a whole different ball game. So the setting of that space at the beginning is really important. And I don't say a safe space, but I now refer to it as a brave space, brave for the teachers and brave for the young people, because it needs that bravery to go near these subjects. I mean, it's always been brave to talk about sex. I mean, even 15 years of doing the job, I was a bit like, oh, okay, what am I going to do today? What's the subject on the menu for today? So I can get it. It's not always easy to approach, but I think that is a real sort of bedrock of how we go near it. And I think when we look at where boys and young men are saying to us they don't feel safe and they don't feel able to share, they feel judged. So they're not feeling seen or heard in that education. That's when it really falls down. And it can be done by setting ground rules really clearly at the start, which says, these is what my expectations are of the lessons, but here's where it differs from a normal English or maths lesson. And schools can't always afford to bring in people externally. They can't always afford to have us in. So we try to sort of set that as a sort of curriculum pointer, if you like, when we're doing training, or even for the resources that Brook have loads on the website that you can access to sort of share that with. And just on that, I think just going back to an example of where I think I reflected a lot on our teaching at Brook in 2021. You'll all remember schools open, was it that March, April 2021? Coincided with the everyone's invited and that sort of influx of that. And our email account at Brook went from 50 emails a day to 1,000 in a day of the schools opening. And it was just like, what the hell is going on? And it was quite knee-jerk in some ways. We've been doing this work for a number of years around sexual harassment and consent, but it was all of a sudden on everyone's agenda. And I spoke to some boys that I was lucky enough to teach from year 8 right through to year 12. And they said that feeling at the time, that knee-jerk reaction, made them feel like they were the ones that were at fault. And it wasn't our fault as teachers or educators, but we didn't respond to it as probably as inclusively as we could. And that's something I've learned from in my practice and now as I teach, just making sure that we centre the voices of all young people, as in particular the boys and young men, so they don't feel they're coming into a battle. I had sexual harassment on my deck ready to go, and as soon as the boys walked in, they groaned, "Oh my God, we're going to feel like we're going to be the ones getting in the neck now." So I just started to take that down and just started to use a conversation rather than trying to teach them through a deck, because it just wasn't working and translating to them. So that's some ways. And I just want to say, like, look, I did this job full time for many years, and teachers are expected to do this in 1 hour with little training and little support around it. So how can we expect, without the right resources behind it, for teachers to do this when we were struggling and it's our full-time job? Everything changes daily. You have to keep on top of it all the time. So I think what works here is not just what works in the lesson, but what works structurally to help and support teachers to navigate this ever-changing environment.
Thank you for those points there. I mean, I think many of us can recognize that moment, which was really huge with everyone's invited and so necessary, right? Like this was bringing to the surface immense amount of harm that had otherwise been ignored, and then allowing that conversation to happen. But thinking through that perspective, that 15-year-old who's never had a meaningful conversation with a girl and was getting the messages from online saying, you're being attacked here, you're being attacked, feminism's gone too far. They were primed to react in that particular way. And so also as an organization doing this work, we had to pay such efforts to actually give them that space where they knew they were actually there to explore things that were important to them as well. So I think that brave space that you said is critical. It doesn't mean you ignore that difficult conversation, but you set it up so people can be brave, when they've been primed to be defensive. So thank you very much, Nick. Patrick, again, we come to teachers having a pretty rough job. I mean, Nick's identified a lot of the pressures that are sitting there. juggling different roles, handling a stressful environment, ever increasingly long work hours, all these sorts of things. So from the teacher's perspective, speaking on behalf of all teachers, but from a teachers and someone who's had a lot of work with teachers, actually, how realistic is it to think that a school can go beyond a one and done type of intervention?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I think that's what the expectation is. You know, I think it was. I'm going to go out. I'm going to go on a limb here and say it was quite commendable that the Prime Minister said what he said in the wake of the Netflix dramatisation of the adolescence drama, and you know his commitment that you know this should be shown in schools. But we've got to be careful that this doesn't end up being lip service, because it kind of feels a bit like that. I'm not having a pop at the Prime Minister, but it kind of feels a bit like that. This has got to be deep and embedded stuff. I think that's kind of what Nick is also saying. This can't be a simple one-off. This can't be a simple assembly or, you know, confined to an hour of PSHE if that hasn't been squeezed in the curriculum. This is about a whole school issue or agenda or response. I think too, we've got to recognise, as you quite rightly say, the pressures that teachers are under. I mean, one of the only points of contact that remains in the lives of public sphere contacts that remains in the lives of the vast majority of children and young people in this country is the school. And it's it's a child's teacher. And we invest so much in what teachers themselves should do. I mean, again, you know, this is possibly the syndrome of somebody that's kind of a bit long in the tooth, but you know, whatever the issue of the day happens to be, I'll sit there and, you know, listening to the radio or whatever it happens to be. And I think, how long will it be before they say, and schools need to, and teachers need to? And I think, well, actually, there are only so many teaching hours in the day. And actually, a child spends the majority of their lives outside of school. So why are we requiring teachers to do more and more? And that often when teachers are not best equipped to doing this important area of work. I'd like to see a whole team built around the child, which includes teachers, but includes a range of other professionals too. And let's not do it on the cheap. Let's invest in it. If this is important enough, this is about the future of our society. I mean, you know, I just saw the patriotic tractor going down the road there, another flag flying. If this is about the future of the country, let's invest in it. Let's commit some resources to it. You know, when numeracy and literacy were seen as major challenges that were thwarting productivity in this country some 30 years ago, government said, we need a national literacy and numeracy strategy. No matter what teachers in the room might have thought about those literacy and numeracy strategies, they were there. They, you know, literally millions were committed to those. Teachers were upskilled in terms of how to deliver those, and they transformed education in this country to the point that we have world-class education. Well, if this matters to this country, then let's see that same transformational zeal being applied in the area of combating misogyny, but moreover, developing those progressive and inclusive cultures within our schools. One of the things that I would say in terms of good practice is bringing teachers together. It's a bit like this kind of setting here today, you know, whether it's teachers, educators, those with an interest in what's going on in our classrooms. We come together from different places, from different spaces, and we share our ideas. We pool our thinking, we challenge each other. Yeah, that's what we do. And that's what teachers used to do back in the day. You know, we had teacher centres everywhere. Every single town and city, there were teachers' centres. And teachers from different schools came together and they talked and they received professional development and they learned and they grew as professionals. In the last 20 years, we've seen a dearth of those teacher centres. where the good practice is unions, trade unions, which we need to get onto the agenda here, saying we will bring teachers together. We will say that no matter where you are in the country, no matter what school you're teaching in, we want you to come together and talk about these very issues. And that's one of the things, for example, that the NASUWT, not the only union, but the NASUWT has done. We need to create that space for teachers to develop the courage and the confidence and the competence to be able to engage their learners in exploring these issues.
Thank you very much. We hear here just the importance of investing in teachers and also understanding there's going to be space that they can't actually work, things they can't achieve. So we need this more systemic approach. Lib, the London Mayor's been working very hard. It's got a strong track record of public intervention to tackle masculinity. Tackling misogyny. I don't know what that slip there was for. So I wanted to know, like, what are you actually seeing? Like, what results are starting to come back from these? Like, what is working? What interventions pay off?
Okay, I was going to kind of highlight three things, I think.
Great.
I mean, the first was to pick up on Nick's point around stigmatization. And also, I think my main lesson from adolescence was not perhaps what other quoted sources got from it, but was just the kind of the distinction between the young person's experience and the adult's interpretation of the young person's experience from it. And that for me means that what we need to be doing and rooting in schools is a much more listening to young people and being able to be much more flexible to adjust to what their challenges are. And so one of the things that we wanted to do at the VRU on the back of that evidence that I talked about earlier on was to set up something called a London Inclusion Charter, which at its heart was saying young people needed to be listened to, and was also talking about the important principle of equity and diversity and how that needed to be very much more embedded in schools. And we do hold best practice events for lots of fantastic practice that is actually going on across London. And we have a charter that now 30 of the London authorities, local authorities out of 32 have signed up to, and many, many more schools. And as a result of that, the Mayor has invested in the UNICEF Respecting Rights programme, of which children's rights is an absolutely kind of driving force of it, reaching over 100,000 young people. So the first for me is how we build a collective voice around inclusion, which is centred around young people, which will benefit all of us, but absolutely would benefit our interpretation of what is going on for a young person. The second is something that we have invested in, and it's great to see Susie in my eyes line from Tender, who, as a result of the work that they've been doing and that we've been sort of partnering with them on, has reached over 28,000 young people over the last couple of years through doing direct healthy relationship training. And the impact of that is that after that has happened, some of it very targeted, some of it more universal in a school, we've seen around 80% recognising a red flag in a relationship and 80% being able to understand what a healthy relationship is. There is plenty of evidence there that if somebody wanted to invest in a programme that is a really important component of any school, go for it. Don't need any more tests and pilots and listen and learns. Just get on with it, really. So that is there's a sort of second thing for me. And the third thing, which is an important part of this, is not, and it's picking up on your point, I think, is that, you know, teachers are overworked. And sometimes aren't just generally the best person to always connect with a young person who struggles with school, you know, and, you know, youth workers and trained specialised people can really get through to young people. And so that whole mentoring youth work at a very community level from somebody who perhaps, you know, can relate to the young person is something that we've spent an enormous amount of time investing in, and we see the results of all the time. And sometimes that's hyperlocal. It might be in an area where there's an intrinsic link between poverty, violence, exploitation, high levels of deprivation, where we're putting in money to very, very grassroots organisations who can connect with those young people. Very often young men who've got disappeared off the radar, but also, you know, in looking at some of the other organisations that are across London, and what comes back from that is the importance of online stuff. And I mentioned it earlier on, but we're just not keeping pace with what's going on online. So we're doing some research on how that is and unfortunately, I think the word is influencing violence actually in a public space, but also thinking about how we can train parents who want training in it, teachers who want training in it, and also young people. And we're doing that with Catch-22 through a scheme called Social Switch. I was a Catch-22 person in the audience as well. Wow, that's good. I'm pressing quite a lot of buttons here, aren't I? Yeah, so I think there is a lot of evidence out there about what works. I'm not complacent that you just rest back on those things, because you've got to keep close, I think, to the challenges, which are fast moving. But all of those things, seems to me, are an important component of how we're going to break this down and really support young boys and men, and obviously also support young women and girls.
Thank you. I'm hearing a lot of alignment, and a lot of the messaging is, listen, we actually know what works in this space. We know how to make some progress on prevention. We just need the adequate resourcing targeted in the right sort of ways and supporting the programs that are in place. That's fantastic. Rachel, I come to you because you've actually got the research that both understands what's going on in the UK, but also looks internationally. And it'd be very interesting, I think, for us to actually start to think about, like, well, what can we be learning about within the UK and bringing back here that's been successful from other countries, and vice versa? Like, what are we doing well that other places can actually look to?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I mean, a lot of what I'm going to say is very similar, well, not very similar, but, resonates very much with what others have said, because obviously it's one world, and misogyny might have many different expressions, but also it's got very similar roots, and, many of the issues are quite similar. So what we saw from the set of studies we looked at across the world, about 15 countries, was start young and repeat values around equality repeatedly throughout a child's school career and make it normal. So in the early years, that's talking about kindness, treating others how you want to be treated. As children get older, becoming more sophisticated. I think also a key part of that is building in critical thinking right from the beginning. That's also been shown to be really important in helping children engage with online content critically, so that they're not just being radicalized by it, but can take out of it what they can look at it and see what it's saying and take the parts that they want, and not those that they don't. Like Nick said, framing really, really matters. We see this around the world. So don't frame boys as a problem and avoid terms like toxic masculinity. Misogyny is a problem. We're all part of a system that perpetuates it, but also we all can do something about it. And I think one thing that I perhaps haven't heard so much about before, but came across in programs that we looked at from Cambodia to Guatemala, was that make gender equality discussions inspirational, that you have the power to do something. You can be part of the solution, almost like make gender equality cool again, make it something that is something aspirational for young people to be part of. And so some of the really interesting programs we looked at managed to do that, sometimes also by involving kids in projects that they defined themselves, that were about how they would tackle it and were much more youth-led. As others have said, you need a brave, a warm or supportive environment to challenge ideas that might be quite deep-seated, quite difficult to process if they're very different to what you've always grown up with, and are different to perhaps what you're hearing in your community, your family, other important people in your life. And I think that it's a long-term process. Exactly what you were saying about one and done really can't work, because often you need to come back to these ideas again and again. Also, there needs to be space for children to say things that are not what teachers or facilitators want to hear. Sometimes they're going to be provocative for the sake of it, but spaces that can handle that. And so that needs facilitators who really are able to do that. And I think one of the interesting things that I heard from all of you is that certainly in the programs we looked at as well, often schools brought in outside facilitators, and on the whole, they were more successful in engaging with young people and generating deeper change. But also, conversely, in cash-strapped environments, that was really, really difficult. But what it sort of brought home to me listening to you all was thinking that there's sort of maybe two levels. There's the direct discussions around sex and consent and relationships that are perhaps better facilitated by somebody with really deep experience in that area, who's trained to do it and isn't, meant really trained and inspired to be a maths teacher or a geography teacher. And then there's the broader level of supportive values for gender equality, and that, I think, is something that can be embedded and should be embedded in all teachers. It should be a key part of teacher education. And whereas Patrick said, there are those support networks, that makes it much easier. And so we did some research in Colombia about how teachers are supported or not to promote gender equality in schools. And actually, one of the things that came out most importantly was their own networks, and how within their networks they supported each other to deal with the challenges that they face, which are often really extreme, of violence and threats in the community when they started talking about gender equality, but also sometimes things like unsupportive head teachers and other teachers trivializing what they came to do. And so I think also investing in support for those kinds of more informal networks can be really important too. And then in terms of the content and how to present it, something that emerged from the studies we looked at was really grounding it in local context and experience that kids can relate to. So one of the programs that were with boys in South African primary schools, largely Black kids, was that they had obviously experienced a lot of racism, and they used that as a starting point to consider their own experiences of discrimination and inequality, and then use that as a segue to talk about the sexism that women and girls in their communities and families were facing, and help to build understanding that way. So that was one really powerful example. And another from Guatemala was looking at violence in the community as a starting point. I mean, the person we interviewed said, we never go in talking directly about misogyny. We start by talking about, violence in your community. Have you experienced violence? What's it like? What makes you feel unsafe? And then moving from that slowly into what's it like for women and girls? What are the kinds of threats they face as well? So that, I think, is another really important thing. I think resonates a lot with what Liv was saying. And finally, then, just one other thing that really came out of this international comparison is that no one thing will make the difference. It needs to be multiple approaches over time. And so really, we've talked a bit about whole school approaches, but really a whole education system approach. So that's at the level of the school, but it's also at the level of teacher training, and it's also at the level of ministries of education giving a signal that they think this is important, and they will support a mandate for misogyny to be taken seriously.
Thank you there. I mean, linking in those different levels up and providing the structure it's so wonderful that we're learning from what's happening overseas. And I could see the translations there. The reality in the UK is that so many of our young people do have an experience of being frightened, of experiencing violence, of feeling insecure. And there's a lot for us to actually give them that space to talk about their own vulnerability, even as they start to think about the position of somebody else and empathize more with them. So certainly I can see directly those approaches being very valuable here. I want to go to policy. I'm a bit aware about time, so we'll keep these short and sharp, but I think we've already done a bit of the work of delving into what good policy would look like. I'm going to go first to you, Nick. From your perspective, actually, what would be some of the key things we could do to promote a more systemic change rather than one-off interventions?
Yeah, I think you've all touched on it. You mentioned whole school approaches. I challenge you to be even further than that. Just the school is one area, but actually looking at it from the sort of, and I think you said, Daniel, around whole society approach. It's something we're really trying to look at in November around sort of narrative change and working and supporting the system around young people and teachers and educators and youth workers, as little as there are left of us. But, I think, here he comes again. Why is it when I'm speaking? Trying to tell me something there, isn't it? I might be like circling for me. I don't know. Where was I? Yeah. So I think that's one way. I think another thing, I mean, policy wise, I've struggled and campaigned for years to get parents involved beyond that. I want to take my son or daughter out of this RSC lesson. That's what I normally speak to them about. Now I think we've got them. we're after adolescence more than we had before. I've had so many parents come my way going, oh, no, I'm interested now, not just around what you're teaching, but how I can support the teaching. But we really need to capitalize on that and not just talk about emojis and colors and all the stuff that was sort of sensationalized in adolescence. How do you have the conversation with your kids around it? So policy around that and support for parents who then support the schools would be, I think, really impactful to look at from that point of view.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Very practical there as well. Rachel, from your research over years and the current context, are there anything you'd like to add? What approaches are missing?
Yeah, I think maybe it's not so much policy, but I think something that, is a bit missing from the discussion is how gender equality is being weaponized as a wedge issue, and particularly the parts of the education system where there's space to discuss and reflect around these issues like sex education. And, we know that it's part of a multi-pronged strategy by conservative, often US funded groups to roll back progressive gender norms as part of a much wider political agenda. And I think what isn't sort of being recognized is how that whole agenda then links to more misogynistic views, to increasing acceptance of violence against women and girls. I mean, sometimes in some countries this is directly aimed at rolling back legislation on domestic violence. In others, it's more subtle, but it's about normalizing and making it acceptable again, more misogynistic views and acceptance of violence. And I think there's maybe a lack of a sense of urgency and strategy to respond to that. And it's understandable. Everyone is so busy, getting on with teaching, getting on with dealing day-to-day problems, but this is going on out there, and I think it's maybe not being recognized enough.
Thank you, Rachel. Lib, I'm interested, you're obviously working here within the city, but what is the role of the regional and what is the role of the national? And do you have any thoughts about which policies should sit with what parts of government?
Yeah, I mean, I think the role of national government would be to develop a VORG strategy that they keep talking about publishing, which I think it is now destined for, what month are we in? Are we still in November? We are, aren't we? Yes, beginning of December then. So apparently, you set in national government, you set the overall objectives, you set the strategy, but more importantly to me, it seems that you then give the long term, and that's such an important word, the long term funding to enable things that you already know work, the space to make impact. And I think you also pick up that third point that you've been discussing here around, the tone and the prioritization, and you remove the structures around such like the education system to enable people to be able to do even more effective work in schools. And I know there's lots of people here been campaigning for that and looking forward to that strategy. And Andrea Simon is in the audience from End Violence Against Women and Girls, has been absolutely in the forefront of it. And I do think it is more than timely that comes out. But what we don't want is then loads of pockets of bits of funding to prove a point that we already know we've got the information for. So that's how I see the national role. I think the regional role is obviously to work closely with government, but it's also to bridge the relationship with other parts of London. We are in a good position with mayoral clout behind us, no statutory function, but to be able to bring together public health, to bring together NHS, to work with all the 32 London boroughs, to work with lots of the VCS organisations, some of whom I've referred to, and to make sure that we can present both a London picture, both in terms of what is best practice, but also a London picture of what we feel the challenges are, and that we can illuminate and highlight the gaps, and hopefully then use the funding that we get, which I then see as investment rather than funding, into the things that we want to be championing. But I also think that both national and regional government has to sometimes recognise they're not where it's at. A lot of this is relationship stuff, and that happens between people at a very, very local level. And, there is something in a local authority that is that placemaker, but there is absolutely something about those local VCS organisations and some of those, local relationships that are fostered at a very neighbourhood level. So I don't think it's that hard, but it does require kind of action and energy and clarity, and certainly does require some money as well if it's a priority.
I'm sure plenty of people in the room would agree with that. Patrick, do you have a final word, either to schools who might be, feeling a bit lost with all of this, of encouragement, or to the government about what could be provided there to schools? Let you choose which direction you want to go with this.
I mean, I don't know about a final word. There's lots of words, but the reality is, in my experience, is that schools want to do this work. Often the space that's available to schools, whether it's to school leaders or to teachers and other practitioners in schools, is that it's made much more difficult to do this work. I mean, Liv talks about the funding challenge. That's a key part of that, without a doubt. But I could list them, but I won't. So it's not a lack of will at the school level. I think it is about how we best support and resource what it is that schools do. But critically, I think it is about political leadership. And I don't think Lib was poo-pooing that. I don't think she was suggesting that national and regional leadership isn't important, because actually what Lib has said reminds me today about the vital importance of that leadership. That leadership across London from the mayor's office is crucially important. I kind of remember, why Margaret Thatcher didn't want to see a Greater London Authority. And we live with the consequences of all of that, not just in London, but elsewhere across the country. You do need to have that leadership operating nationally and regionally. And at the moment, I'm not sure we're seeing enough of that. Certainly at the national level. I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see more urgency attached to that leadership. We've just had a report from the National Curriculum and Assessment Review, chaired by Becky Francis. Really interesting stuff embedded in that review, recommendations in that review, including how schools can prepare their students in terms of critical thinking, in terms of oracy. In other words, if you're going to develop skills around oracy, you've got to be talking to each other. You've got to have relationships at school level. All the things that actually been driven out of practice in so many schools, that it's been about delivery. Show me the scores. Show me the test results. Show me the league table position. We've got to find a way of getting away from that. And that requires national leadership to create the kind of environment, the ecosystem within our schools, which makes this kind of work possible.
Thank you. A shift in priority is needed here to tackle something that's so vitally important. We'd love to hear your thoughts here. I'm going to collect questions. If you've been jotting them down, that would be great. Just raise your hands. Okay. First hand was at the back. Well, I'll take three at once, and then we'll pass them to group. So maybe 1, 2, and then 3.
Oh, hi everyone. Good evening. I'm Kirsty from the Children's Society. Thank you, panelists. I just wanted to ask if you could prioritise one change, kind of quick fire styly. What would that change be with this work? Thank you.
Okay. We'll go, to another question, maybe just in front. Yeah.
Hi everyone. I'm Vanessa. I work at Everyone's Invited. Just thinking, Nick, you mentioned parents and carers and working with them, and I think there's I've just found this whole discussion so fascinating. I think Patrick and Rachel, what you were talking about, this like gender transformative whole child approach, parents and carers are so important in that, in thinking of the sort of systemic nature of how to tackle these issues in education. From running our own sort of primary school long-term intervention, addressing this with parents and carers is so difficult. And I hear what you're saying, Nick, that like there was a shift after adolescence, but actually what schools have said to me is the parents and carers that we need to be in these sessions aren't coming. So do you know what works? Do you have any insights? I'd love to know.
Come down. We'll work our way this way. I've got a mic. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Rachel Wilder. I'm a lecturer at the University of Bath. I work with the colleagues that you mentioned. I've been working with Mighty Girls recently in Wiltshire and Baines on youth-led social action in schools. And they run a program called Positive Relationships that works with young people on healthy relationships. And then those young people design a program or project tackling an issue that they identify themselves. And one of the big things that's really come out of this is kind of thinking about what are the opportunities for young people to have a voice in their schools. We've seen a lot of literature suggesting that young people feel powerless, they don't have a voice, they're not listened to. If they're invited to voice something, it's confidentially through like anonymous hotlines or emails. And I'm really curious about what your perspectives are about how to change that culture. I think we have a policy environment where young people are not seen as protagonists in their schools. They don't feel that they are owners or, leaders in their schools. And how do we kind of change that? I like the term you used, Patrick, around a school ecosystem where young people actually feel this is their place, it's their school, and how can they actually, be part of that change process?
Fantastic. I'll tell you what, we'll leave what's the number one change. You just think about that, and it'll be our final sign off. You've taken my job. Well done. We'll go first to this one about how do we actually get the parents who need to be in the room, and this probably applies to the teachers that need to be in the room. We have great champions of this work, as whatever we talk about, but how do we get the ones who really actually a bit defensive and might maybe need the intervention more? Any suggestions from the panel?
Yeah, I know we're looking at it from an education point of view, but we may not need to think of it as how we get them into a room. We don't need to have them in school to do that. How do we reach parents beyond schools? I'm not saying it's another thing for schools to do here. I'm thinking about how do we look at engaging with parents, whether it's with resources specifically for them, whether it's for training and education specifically for them, or is it about talking to parents about what they need? We used to run a number of parent sessions, and it was mainly around here's what we're teaching, here's what we're going to be giving your young people, not what do you need at home to have these conversations beyond that 1 hour lesson. They're at home a lot more than what we are with their kids, so they are the key educators beyond us, better than us. So how do we get them involved? And it's kind of that participatory element, which links to your section as well about that ecosystem. How do you involve parents in that as well? That's just quickly from me. Anyone else want to add?
Yes, Lynn, please.
I think I agree with that. It's starting the conversation in a different place, isn't it? I think when we first set up 6.5 years ago, we kind of wanted to reach parents, and as usual, you go out and you speak to people, and some bright spark says, "Oh, you need a parenting program." And we probably mulled that over for a little while and then thought, actually, that's completely the wrong approach, because the people who are going to turn up to a parenting program aren't necessarily the people who we want to be reaching. And it needs to be done in a much more informal way, because by and large, the parents who feel are most alienated from the education system have had some trauma themselves when they went through the education system. So actually going through that kind of grassroots, voluntary kind of setting has been incredibly helpful. And we've built through that on a very, very localized basis, and working with local partners, a sort of a network of 20,000 parents across London. And what we noticed from that was that 90% of them were female. And the issue was, how do we reach, particularly pertinent, obviously, to the conversation we're having today around male role models, how do we reach some of those fathers who, for a variety of different reasons, aren't in the space and want to engage? And we've now got two fantastic, one in North London, one in South London, pilots where a consortia of organisations have come together and are directly working with fathers in communities who haven't really been part of any kind of educational process before. Obviously, they've been to school. I'm not suggesting they haven't, but I more meant advocating on behalf of their kids. That is just alien to them because they don't feel comfortable in that space. And as a result of that, we're seeing a lot of improved engagement. So I'm very happy. I don't know if we're sending around resources or links after this, but very happy to add those to it. But I think it's starting from the premise, which was, I think, your initial point. It's not kind of going to where people are, but it's not assuming things that once you set something up, everybody's going to come to it. I think it's also worth adding in that the tender program that I referred to earlier on, we've been investing in, has also reached some parents as well. I think it's about 5,000 parents, as well as some teachers. Actually, it's 5,000 teachers, and it's more like 2,000, I think, parents across that cohort. So there is some space then, if those informal networks around a school also work to encourage parents to come in.
Thank you. And I know there's also working happening at popular narratives media, like how can you get those messages through and actually start some of the conversations and direct them. And maybe this is leading. So how do you start conversations where actually young people are involved and have their voices heard and feel like they're shifting something in the school? You know, and I think several of us or several of the panel touched upon this. Don't know if anyone's got either a program they think is particularly effective there or a general principle to make that shift.
Well, I mean, what I would say in relation to that, not necessarily identifying a specific project or program, is the vital importance of recreating, remodeling schools as a democratic space. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Learners should be leaders of their own learning, and they should have the space to do that. And we should be respecting, the voice of children and young people as part and parcel of that learning experience. At the same time, teachers. I mean, and I come at this from the perspective of someone who's been responsible for leading teachers. Teachers should also feel that they have agency, their voices are being respected and valued as leaders of teaching and learning. And all too often, that is not the lived experience of teachers. So we've in various ways spoken about the importance of relationships within the school setting. Well, how do we create the kind of really generative relationships that are going to be really important in this space in terms of the issues that we're seeking to tackle and to resolve? If the key actors in this process feel completely disempowered, learners feel disempowered, but their teachers feel that as well. So clearly, I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't stuff that can happen within a school. Of course, there is always scope to do things differently within my school. But the reality is that we're dealing with 23,000 schools, and this is at scale nationally. It's at scale internationally too, it has to be said, because actually the paradigm that has entered our landscape for education and how we organize education has frankly, it's generated the problems that we're seeing right here, right now. So it's not about throwing everything out and saying that nothing works, but it is about a bit of a paradigm shift about what is the nature of education. What should education be about? How do you place the child and the teacher at the center of that teaching and learning experience?
Adine, is that okay? So one of the sort of, I think, privileges actually of having led the violence reduction unit is that we very early on decided to set up a young people's action group. We pay, we mentor, we interview, we have a group of young people who co-produce our strategy, evaluate where it's working, give us advice and go and advocate. And when we translated that into what needed to change in school based on the Bath research, they were very, very integral to shaping up the Inclusion Charter. They were integral to saying children's voices and rights need to be at the heart of this, hence the investment in the Rights Respecting UNICEF programme, but also then taking that out to schools. And some of them have gone out to schools and talked with teachers there and trying to shift what is going on. And knowing from what we see across London already, there are lots of good practices that are already in existence. And what I think our job has to be, and I mean collectively our job, is to amplify those stories. Yes, pass the information between, but amplify them. And partly because I think sometimes we set up this idea that there's teachers here, young people here, or there's achievement at school through exams and well-being over here, and that those two things have to be in conflict. And of course they don't. And what we actually need to be doing is making sure that, you attain in school, and you attain by and large if you've got the kind of things that are helping you to develop as a person at the same time as, the academic results, and that we're not trying to set teachers up against young people. It's coming together, and certainly the exercise we've done around the influencing role of the Charter has enabled us to do quite a lot of that, and see into so much good practice that is going on across London. And somebody, I think might have been yourself, talking earlier on about how important it is we do provide something positive, because I think you can feel a bit sort of weighed down by the scale of the challenge. And if you can't see any shifting of any practice, it can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming. But there is good stuff there.
Fantastic. Rachel, please. Okay. Yeah, plenty of hands. Let's try to take them all, and we'll see if I can piece them together. But I'll just say brief, sharp questions.
Okay, I will try my best. So my question was that, the whole education system is still inherently industrial. So if you care about math grades way more than if you're a misogynist, then, so I think a lot of you guys have already touched upon my questions. So I will move on to the fact that so I just completed research on how practitioners themselves who are engaging in this field sort of face burnout and fatigue. So what are different ways that teachers themselves can be supported? Because if maybe they're an external organization, maybe there's organizational support, but how can teachers who push back saying that, math grade aren't everything, or your scores in science is not all that counts, but also these other aspects of life? Because how information is sort of legitimized, right? We saw Keir Starmer do 6-7, and so the kids think, oh, that's cool, right? Like we can do that. So then the teacher is going to be like, yo, I tried so hard to push, and now this, so how do you sort of support teachers?
Okay. Support for teachers in the front, yeah.
Hello, Caroline Harper. I'm the director of the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion team here at ODI. And I hear a lot on the panel of concern about social media. And I also notice that most people in this room are not natives of technology. So we've done a couple of pieces of work looking at social media, and we have seen that Andrew Tate is influential in India and in other countries, that young men love him. But we've also seen that actually, they're not, that young people, we've seen some positive outcomes of that. So it'd be really interesting to know what the panel wants to know. What evidence do you need to deal with the whole problem of social media? You've all mentioned it. What do you need to know that you don't feel you know? And what do you think would be useful questions to ask? And maybe Rachel could tell us a bit more about what we found out about sort of social media globally and the influence on young people, and any pathways that out of that.
Thank you. There's one at the back. People, please, yeah.
Hi, Cynthia Fortledge. I'm an independent consultant. I have probably a controversial question for you. So I come from the background of leading the women's movement nationally in Canada, of being involved with the global LGBTQ+ movement, including at the UN level, and being a child of the 70s, 80s, where parents were deferring to schools to take over some parenting. My question is, given the context that the data that you started with, we know that the unreported data for violence against women and girls is underreported by at least 6x to the numbers you were quoting. We know that as of a couple of weeks ago in Westminster, the group Male Allies UK released a Voice of the Boys report, and over 80% of boys saying they don't have a space to figure out how to be a boy. So the question is, are we asking too much of schools?
Yep, there's one at the back. Andrew, okay. Let's get a question answering while we're picking these last couple up. I mean, there's two that I think quite linked. Are we asking too much of schools? And how do you support? Well done. Finished, right? And I think there's probably going to be nods down the row on that one. But then given that, like, how do you actually support the teachers?
I mean, I'd kind of say, yeah, we're asking too much of schools, but I'd kind of also say no. I mean, it's typical politician's answer. We've got to be asking the right things of schools. I think that's the point. I mean, if we're asking the impossible of schools, then we're asking too much. And teachers often feel that they're swimming against the tide in this particular space, feeling that they're doing this work without support. And when we talk about the question about how you sustain teachers to do this work, or indeed how you give confidence and courage to teachers to push back sometimes when it's necessary to push back. And by the way, I'm interested in Keir Starmer and cool. I don't often hear that in the same sentence. So thanks for that. But I also think it links to Caroline's question about social media and the evidence that's needed. So if we're asking the right things of schools, then we've got to recognise that this is a whole society response to the question of, how these regressive and hostile forms of masculinity are being developed. It's not per se that I think Andrew Tate is attracted to some young men, but that rather that the algorithms are feeding this. So when we talk about the industrial model of schooling, well, what about the industrial model of the way in which young people are accessing information? I said earlier that I was brought up in simpler times. It was Auntie Beeb where I got my knowledge of the world from. Now you take your pick. So what evidence do we need is, how are young people engaging with these platforms? How do these algorithms, how are they working in practice? And how can we perhaps begin to hijack some of that for use in our own classrooms and in more progressive settings?
Yeah, I might add a little bit on that. And Caroline asked also about, what research from young people internationally is showing on social media consumption. I mean, one of the really interesting things we found in our research in Mexico was that certainly some boys were being radicalized by the content they were viewing on social media, but a lot more were selecting content that chimed with the views they already had, more or less. And so it really pointed to the importance of their offline experience, their family, their community, their neighbors, the churches, sports, all the other influences in their lives. And so to me, that's really emphasizing the importance of offline role models and supporting, as people have said, whole of society approach. And then one other thing I wanted to say was, again, coming from Latin America, we've seen some really interesting results where progressive gender equality organizations have worked with influencers and content creators, recognizing that a lot of the light entertainment space, the kind of social media consumption, the videos and lifestyle content and so on, that quite traditional regressive gender norms content is being embedded there. So what some progressive organizations have done is not ceded that space only to the conservative movement, but again have been working with content creators and talking about the kinds of narratives that they would like to amplify, and then letting content creators run away with that because they know how to reach the people they want to create. So they're not trying to sort of direct very, very rigidly, but kind of sharing the core of the ideas and the narrative and then letting it go from there.
I just quickly touch on the support one. Well, what I'd love to see from research is understanding more about why the algorithms do what they do. I think that's what I'd love to know more about. I've been looking into this for years and I still can't work it out. The support question, who was that? Yourself? You did? Okay, share, please. But it's almost like once it's been done, it's changing again, isn't it? And it's like, yeah.
Absolutely.
And just on the support one, just quickly, a really good example of good practice was we delivered safeguarding supervision for DSLs in schools when there was a disclosure of sexual assault or abuse. And that was commissioned by it's up north, up near Liverpool. The local authority commissioned us at Brook to do that. and we sort of rejigged the money that we had for other reasons into that, and it was really successful in helping those teachers to cope with that. And we've said scale that, have that supervision beyond the DSLs, but also for teachers that need to tap into that support when they're dealing with the issue that they're dealing with in school. So I think that could be something that could be widened and modelled out. Not just from people like Brooke, there's loads of people in this space, some of them in this room here, that could talk to that as well. So I think that needs to be looked at more for teachers, definitely. Sorry, I know your time. You want to probably first on, Daniel.
Yeah, my latest thing. Yeah, I think we had 2 hands up. So very quickly, those questions. Yep.
Is this on? I work at Social Development Direct, and a lot of our work is on gender-based violence and safeguarding in the international development and humanitarian space. One of my questions is how, we're talking about misogyny, responding to misogyny, but violence prevention is maybe a really good value for money, longer term, sustainable endeavor. So how can we focus on prevention in the longer term here in a domestic space? For example, Australia now banning the use of social media for under 16s. Just be really interested to hear some of your thoughts on that at such a large scale as well.
I think there was one more question.
Don't have much time, actually. You finished, I think. But very quickly, I'm Andrea Simon. I'm the director of the End Violence Against Women Coalition. Interesting, we've had a conversation about misogyny and really talked about any of the intersections and intersectional experiences of young people, which is obviously vital because all of those different aspects of identity really do shape misogyny, racialized misogyny in particular. But my question was, my comment was that absolutely we should be tackling this issue in schools. Schools are a site of harm for girls and young women. So fundamentally, it absolutely has to be tackled there. Otherwise, we're just allowing a lot of sexual violence and sexual harassment, which is happening at schools, to go on unabated. When we did polling a few years ago, it came back that 60% of girls said they'd experienced sexualized harassment and sexist name calling in schools. About a quarter of them had experienced that from teachers themselves. So we're not just talking about what the school environment is doing to deal with sexual harassment between young people, but also how it can be an environment which is allowing and perpetuating harmful gender norms to exist. So I don't really have a question. I just wanted to make those comments.
It was a very good input there. Very good input. So then, listen, I'm going to tie these 2 things together. Final comment from the panelists. You could either reflection on the overall talk. You can answer the question from the person at the back, or you can pick up what is the one thing we should do, as soon as possible. Your choice. We'll start with you, Nick.
Do both. Cheap. Very quickly. I work for a Australian-led company now, November, so I am all over this social media stuff through my colleagues. Look, you're going to take that away, that's fine, but what are you going to put in its place? Are you going to put place-based stuff in there for young people? That's going to now feel a loss of connection, even more so than what they've got already. So there needs to be thought and funding around that for sure. Final thought, and I didn't speak of this earlier, but was one sort of change I'd sort of say needed to be made is obviously is madness that it stops at 16 at year 11. It needs to be mandatory beyond it. When young people are most likely to be having sexual activities, when we stop talking to them about it in schools or education, it just doesn't make any sense to me. So I know some schools do this in sixth form, but it's not a mandatory requirement. So I think that is one kind of my parting words.
Thank you. Rachel.
One change, that's so hard. I flitted around, what did I want to say? I think I'm going to cheat and have 2. One is responding to what Patrick said about the sort of systemic change that needs to happen to make schools a space where there is more space for oracy, for discussion, for relationship building, all of those kinds of changes. The other one is actually picking up on the last thing that Andrea said as well, about 25%, I think you said, of that sexist harassment comes from teachers. I think it's embedding it right from the start in initial teacher training, but also in refresher training. It probably seems boring to come across this stuff again and again and again, but repeating reminders does make a bit of a difference.
Patrick?
One thing, gosh, I'm not used to that, but I mean, just picking up that point about, banning use of social media by under 16s, just to take that one as an example. I mean, you know, the union that I used to lead, we certainly took the view that banning use of mobile phones, for example, in schools was the right thing to do, because they were being used as a lethal weapon by pupils. And in many respects, I still hold to that view. But actually, we've got to be developing in young people the skills to be able to navigate a world in which, you know, having access to a mobile phone is going to be part and parcel of their lives. Having to navigate social media environments is going to be part of their lived reality. So yeah, ban if you wish, but what you're going to do with these young people? The more that we keep on in this space saying we don't talk about that, we don't do that, is the more that those who are peddling and in the back office of developing the algorithms, which is driving young people to certain kinds of content, the more that they're going to gain even more ground. Just one final reflection, and it comes back to something that, and I mean, great question from Andrea. I thought, not a question, but I thought the observation was absolutely bang on. Particularly the reminder to us about, the role of teachers and how that role can be a force for good or not. Yeah. And if that is a quarter of the experiences of girls, is that it's teachers who have been engaging in misogynistic or harassing behaviours towards sexist language towards female students, that should be a wake-up call for us. Yeah. So the government is right now talking about, as manifesto commitment, 6,500 more teachers. I think that's fantastic, but I want 6,500 of the right teachers, not just anyone. Because, just because I've got a pulse doesn't make me a great teacher. I'm just trying to find it. But anyway, it doesn't make me a great teacher. What I want is teachers with the progressive values and the ability and commitment to engaging with their students in this particular space. And just to come full circle in terms of where I started, in terms of how none of this is new. Back in 1919, the union that I used to lead was born, and it was born at the end of the First World War by men returning from the field of battle, saying, what could we do? We could teach. By the way, we've got a particular role to play here. We should be teaching boys. Male teachers for boys. That was the narrative back in 1919. A century on, and it's almost as if we're still talking about in the same vein in this particular space. What we should be talking about is how can we develop a diverse workforce? Absolutely. I would like to see more men in teaching. But how do we develop a teacher workforce which has the progressive values, the critical faculties that we need in this particular space? If there's something that we do need to get a handle on, it is how to build a teaching profession that is going to meet head on the challenges that we face in the 21st century.
So I'm having flashbacks to my 1980s row with my RE teacher, who told me that a girl who was wearing a short red miniskirt was asking for it. And I nearly, by having that argument, nearly ended up in a slightly different place. But anyway, I think for me in school, I think we've really got to look for the leadership around this separation between, as I mentioned earlier, that you can only attain results, and that's the key thing about school, versus actually we need a much more holistic, child-centered, absolutely teacher-trained and teacher-involved environment, which also prioritizes well-being and opens up conversations. I like your brave spaces rather than safe spaces, actually, but that's exactly, I think, what we should be aiming for. And on a wider, on the wider national picture, I think we've got to go with it's everybody's business. Keeping people safe, and it's everybody should be paying attention to violence against women and girls, and that does require an elevation of prevention, and it requires us using the data we've already got, and it requires proper funding, not dribs and drabs of funding, because this should be an absolute priority. Where we started was whether it was described as an epidemic or not, and we only get rid of epidemics if you are really concentrated on how you're going to attack it. It seems to me we've got a wealth of evidence sitting in the room, but wealth of other evidence outside to show what we need to be doing, and certainly the principles by which we need to address it. So those would be my two.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming here tonight. I hope you were as informed, stimulated, inspired by our panel and their contributions. I mean, we covered things from practical interventions to support for teachers to some of the systemic changes that need to happen, how we can actually change the entire dialogue and narrative that we have about the education system. We picked up points about how this is impacting upon women and girls, men and boys, perhaps less so people of marginalised genders. I wanted to ask you all just to give a huge and generous round of applause to our panel. That was generous, thank you. From a personal perspective, huge thanks to ODI Global for hosting us here today, and also for Emily Tunt, who's done so much of the work. I would say this was actually originally down for probably 3 months ago, and then there was a transport strike and we had to adapt last minute and change. But it's been a lot of work, and it's been fantastic to work with ODI and with Emily. So please also a round of applause for them. And with that, I hope the questions and conversation can continue over the sort of networking get together we can have outside. So please do consider staying around. Thank you.